Good afternoon, everybody. How many good conservatives do I have in the room today? Can I hear you applaud, please? Appreciate you all coming out. My name is Lenny McAllister. I'm a host and producer on News Radio 1020 KDKA for those of you from the western half of the state in the great city of Pittsburgh. I'm also a host on Night Talk Get to the Point, which airs Friday nights at 8 p.m., which means I will be bolting out of here after this panel is over on the Pittsburgh Cable News Channel. We appreciate you coming out today. Our panel is called There's More to Life Than Taxes. Don't we all know that, right? We don't work for the government. We work for our families. We work for our legacy. Now, before we get into the panelists here, what I want to do is remind you that there's little note cards on your tables. If you have any questions, write down your question as our great panelists are going forward. And make sure you write down your question. Bring it over to the stage right here. I'll pick it up. When we get into Q&A, I'll make sure that you have an opportunity to get your question heard and addressed by this panel of experts. Now, the introductions are in your programs. I don't want to go through them because we don't have much time. You've heard a lot of great speakers, and I want to hear what they have to say. So I'm going to jump to Nate first. And what these folks are going to do for you today is they're going to go through where we are, what we've been through at different levels of government, federal, state, local, and how in the world do we get more revenue without doing what liberals think you have to do, which is basically raising taxes. So let's start out with Nate. Nate Benefield, can you give us a little bit of where we are as far as status quo with state policies and tax policies as we are right now in 2015?
Sure, absolutely, Lenny, and thanks for that introduction. And I want to thank Loma and Henry for organizing this event and this panel because, you know, who doesn't want to talk about taxes on April 17th? But, you know, it is an important discussion because we're here in the state of Pennsylvania, we're discussing and having a debate over whether or not to raise our state taxes, and it's an important, critical debate to have. And you want to give, you know, some context and where we are. And the reality is Pennsylvania has had a trend where we increase spending and raise taxes year after year. We currently have, and I'm kind of borrowing Joe Henchman's Tax Foundation numbers, we have the 10th highest state and local tax burden in the country. And we used to be 24th. Back in '91, we were middle of the pack, and we've moved up that ladder of higher and higher taxes. We've increased our total state spending since 1970 by $16,000 per family of four. Now, that's an increase per family after adjusting for inflation of $16,000 a year. And we've done that because in 44 of the last 45 years, we have increased state spending. So that's the trend. Governor Tom Wolf has come in now and said he wants to be a new kind of governor and change the status quo. So what does he do to show that? He proposes higher spending and increasing taxes. In fact, he's proposed the highest tax increase in Pennsylvania's history, and as a percentage of our revenue, the highest tax increase since Governor Milton Shapp in 1971. And all that time, he's promising, though, going around, you're going to get property tax relief. This is basically a Santa Claus budget. You're going to get a present, and you're going to get a present, and you've been a good boy, so you're going to get a lot of presents this year, but none of you are going to have to pay for it. But the reality is, and I have to give some bad news now, and I want to give warning to those watching at home on PCN, if you're watching with children in the room. First off, it's a weird thing to watch with children. It's not the great programming for kids. But second, they might want to cover their ears, because here's some bad news. There is no Santa Claus. And whether you're talking about presents under the tree or a $4.7 billion tax increase, somebody's going to have to pay. And in Governor Wolf's plan, businesses are going to pay. He wants to tax natural gas companies. Families are going to pay. He wants to raise the income tax across the board on everyone. And he's going to raise the sales tax on everyone. On top of that, he wants to expand the sales tax to everything from cradle to the grave. So if you have small children, babies, you're going to have to pay taxes on diapers. If you have children a little bit older in daycare, you're going to pay tax on the daycare. If you have children going to college, you're going to pay taxes on their textbooks, on their activity fees, on their meal plans. If you're getting a little older in life and maybe look at a nursing home, well, you're going to pay taxes on nursing home care. And then when you die, you would pay a tax on your tombstone and on your funeral services. So that is a huge tax increase. It comes to about, on net, $1,400 more per family of four tax increase. So I want to stop a little bit and just remind people about turning in your question cards. And while you do that, I'll offer you a deal. if you turn in your question card with a dollar bill, I'll take that dollar bill. I'll keep it in my pocket for a year. I'll come back to PLC next year, see you in PLC 2016, and I'll give you 30 cents back. That's 30 pennies for just $1. So I hear a little laughter. But that's the same deal Governor Wolf is offering. He's going around the state talking about how he wants to lower property taxes, but in reality, he would raise taxes right now at the state level, promise property tax relief in another year, and only give back 30 cents on every dollar in new taxes. So what can we do to stop this bad deal? Well, the governor has already come out and launched his challenge to us and said, it's not good enough to just say no to higher taxes. You've got to say what you're for. And that's true. We can't just say no. We have to offer alternatives. I mean, if you're a progressive, yes, you can say no to pension reform or liquor store privatization or right to work or paycheck protection or school choice and still be progressive. But if you want to stop the highest tax increase in Pennsylvania's history, well, you're just in the way of progress. But the good news is we do have solutions. There's legislation that has been introduced called the Taxpayer Protection Act, which would limit the growth of state spending and prevent this cycle of overspending in good years and raising taxes in bad years. We have legislation that would enact prevailing wage reform. Basically, we're forcing the state and school districts to pay thousands of dollars, actually billions of dollars more each year on construction projects because we require them to pay more than the private sector pays. We need to slow the growth in our welfare programs by curbing waste, fraud, and abuse, and by encouraging work rather than discouraging work. We should end corporate welfare. It doesn't make sense for us to ask families and businesses to pay more in taxes while we give out hundreds of millions of dollars every year to corporations. And unfortunately, Governor Wolf wants to take us the wrong direction, adding another $100 million more in subsidies for alternative energy companies like Solyndra. And lastly, we need tax reform that encourages economic growth, not government growth. So I'd love to tackle more of these in the questions and discussion, but just to summarize, I want you to remember three things. One is that Governor Wolf is offering more of the same, higher taxes on middle-class families. Second, that Governor Wolf is promising only 30 cents in property tax relief for every dollar in new taxes. And lastly, that we as fiscal conservatives do have solutions to balancing our budget without asking more of working families. So thank you.
Thank you, Nate. And as I go down the panel, and I go to Joseph Henchman now. Joseph, I heard Nate say something about Pennsylvania in the early 90s being in the middle of the pack nationally in regards to state taxation. And now we're trying to be number one for all the wrong things. Can you explain how we're getting there and how we fit in regards to the rest of the country? Who are our competitors when it comes to jobs, in regards to tax policies, and the types of things that we need to do to make our Commonwealth more competitive?
That's a great question. It's a good thing to start off on. In fact, it's something that we talk about with, we at the Tax Foundation talk about with policymakers all over the country as we talk to them. And I like to do a little exercise, and if you'll indulge me, I'd like to do it here too.
Please do.
If I could ask everybody to please stand up, including the panelists here on the stage. If for $1, Nate had a $1 deal, here's my $1 deal. If for $1, you'll walk out that door and get in your car and go on home and not see the speeches for the rest of today, you can go ahead and sit down. How about for $10? $100? $1,000? Some people are starting to sit down, all right. How about $10,000? All right. And we got some real dedicated people still standing. All right, you can have a seat now. Incentives matter, and taxes as an incentive matter. And too often in this country, the debate over taxes is a debate not about what can we do to incentivize job creation and economic growth, but just what do we do with the after effects? How do we distribute the benefits? And it's our goal at the Tax Foundation, at the federal and state level, to make the debate about taxes not one about distribution, but about economic growth. What can we do to ensure that we're creating jobs and growing the economy and setting a permanent basis and a permanent pattern for that going forward? So we've got a number of tools that we do that with. Nate mentioned our analysis of state tax burdens, and he's exactly right, that Pennsylvania used to be middle of the pack and is now on its way into the top 10. We also put out a study every year called the State Business Tax Climate Index that looks at 100 different variables of state tax structure and evaluates the states. And I've got my little crib sheet here with where Pennsylvania stands. So out of the 50 states, 1 being the best and 50 being New Jersey, Pennsylvania is 34. So 34th out of the 50 there, and we break it down into all the different component taxes. So on individual income tax, 17th best. And you got a flat tax and it's a low rate, although Governor Wolf wants to change that. Sales tax, 24th. Again, you've got a kind of a middle rate and kind of middle of the country. Property taxes, 42nd. That's probably not a surprise to a lot of people here. Corporate and business taxes, 46th. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Pennsylvania's got the second highest corporate income tax, not just in the United States, but in the industrialized world. And I'm sure that's a troubling thing to make the case about when you're trying to get businesses to move into Pennsylvania. And you get a prize here, 50th out of 50, for your unemployment insurance tax system. So you've got a very high, complex tax system for unemployment insurance, which is something that all businesses pay. And it's one of those weird taxes that it hits you the hardest when the businesses are most down on the ground. So if you're looking for areas of improvement, it's some of those there. Now, it's not all good, it's not all bad news, of course. I work in state tax policy all over the country, and there's a lot of good opportunities and models to emulate out there. And too often at a lot of these conferences, it becomes this litany of sad news and bad news about what's going on out there and how can we do something better. But actually, there's a lot of good stuff happening in state tax policy out there, and I just wanted to tell you a few examples. North Carolina, 2 years ago, passed a big comprehensive tax reform. Republicans came in for the first time since Reconstruction. They knew they wanted to do something completely different, and so they did a complete overhaul. Simplified the tax system, lowered the income tax. It was 7.75%. They brought it down to 5.75%. Lowered the corporate tax rate, repealed the death tax, and now they're looking at what other tax reforms they can do. In Indiana, they're not out to do the big whiz-bang tax reform, but every year they do a little tax reform every year and helps move the ball. So 2013, they repealed their death tax. In 2014, they reduced their income and corporate taxes, and the corporate tax is going to drop every year for the next 10 years. Last year, they did a big change on their personal property tax that simplifies and reduces that. And then this year, in fact, right now, this week, the governor is going to sign into law a simplification for businesses for their sales taxes. New York, oh, that must be a typo. What's New York doing on here? No, actually, New York did a big corporate tax reform last year, which, if Governor Wolf can look to anybody for guidance, can he look to Governor Cuomo of New York? New York's tax system used to be you calculate your tax 4 different ways and you pay the highest. So they're asked all these businesses there, you got to calculate 4 different ways. We worked with Governor Cuomo to come up with a system to immediately reduce it to 3 ways. That's progress. Phase it down and over time reduce it to 2 ways. Lowered the rate, broadened the base. Instead of having multiple different taxes with different rules, combine it all in one. And by our metric, it's going to be the best corporate tax system of any state with a corporate tax. And that goes to show it's not just about revenue. New York's never going to be the low-cost, low-tax state, but you can collect that revenue in a way that doesn't do harm to the private sector, doesn't impact job creation, and is simple for people to comply with. And that's what we're all about here at the Tax Foundation. And Ohio is a neighboring state, and I thought I'd just close and mention that one because just this week they reached an agreement to put through a tax plan that cuts taxes in Ohio by $1.2 billion a year. So we see what's going on all over the country in red states, blue states, and purple states. It's how do we stay competitive, not just with each other, but globally? How do we create an environment for job creation? And how do we simplify things for taxpayers and businesses alike? And hopefully that's a path Pennsylvania can get back on. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Now, Dr. Hawk, over at the Allegheny Institute, you all are looking at how the state tax structure impacts the local communities, impacts the townships and the counties, et cetera. Can you explain to us what that fight is looking like for these townships? We all know that Politics is deepest at its local level, at the lowest level possible. How are people fighting the good fight there at that level when it comes to tax and tax reform?
Well, the short answer is not very well. Let me just make a few comments before I get to that. By the mid-20th century, it had become sort of commonplace view that governments were the answer to all your problems, and that has only gotten worse since. And that has led to ever-expanding governments. As Nate mentioned before, the level of expenditures have just grown exponentially. And to fund those expenditures at the state and local level, since you cannot print money, you got to raise taxes. So the problem at the state level is manifest as well at the local level. Now, all the taxes in this state that can be collected will boggle your mind. Unless you're a tax accountant, you have no idea what you're in for when you move to Pennsylvania. Let me just run through a few at the state level. Besides the corporate tax, there's the public utility realty tax, the insurance premium tax. And that's very important because the insurance premiums on casualty policies helps pay for municipal pensions, financial institution taxes, sales taxes, cigarette taxes, malt and beverage taxes, liquor taxes. And at the local level, you've got wage taxes. In all, there are 25 specific taxes that the state of Pennsylvania levies and 14 taxes that local governments can levy. Now, you have to remember that any tax that the local government or the school district levies has to be approved by the state. They're creatures of the state. They have to be approved by the state, which leads me to a problem that is a combination of local issues and state issues, and that is the property assessment laws in Pennsylvania. The property assessment laws in Pennsylvania are a mess, basically because Pennsylvania does not require a cycle of reassessments like 48 other states do. We're one of 2 states that do not do that. There's no auditing of the value, of the accuracy of assessments. It's just basically left up to local counties to decide what the assessment's going to be. We recommended in a report 8 years ago that the state take more seriously its role in the assessment issue, because if you're going to have property taxes, they need to be fair. If they're going to be fair, you have to have correct values. And the state has just let that wander all over the place. We recommended that they institute a set of changes that would require regular assessments, either that or have a trigger mechanism when the assessments got too far off by some statistical measure that the counties would reassess. We recommended that the state put money into this because at the bottom, it is their responsibility to make sure that assessments are fair. They've appointed 2 separate task forces to look at this issue. And the last task force, which reported in 2012 to a House resolution, basically said we need to study this some more. On the question of should counties develop a methodology for deciding when to reassess, study it some more. On the question of whether the state should mandate periodic assessments, study some more. That was their answer to everything. That was 3 years ago, this April, or this month. And so far, as best I can tell, nothing is happening. The assessment issue, the Supreme Court ruled in a 2009 decision that it would not outlaw base year assessment management. But if this legislature didn't do something about it, they may have to consider doing that. Because this is important. There is such thing as a uniformity clause in the Constitution. If you're going to tax people, you need to know that it's fair. And in Pennsylvania, we're just not doing that, and it's time, if we're going to continue property taxation, that we address that issue. So my answer to your question that you originally raised, taxes at the local level are as important an issue as they are anywhere else. They're just on a smaller scale, unless you're a big city. People don't like paying taxes, but on the other hand, a lot of people are demanding more and more government services, so they have to either decide whether they're going to cut the services or they're going to raise the taxes, because unlike the federal government, you cannot print dollars. And that's the fundamental difference. Thank you.
Professor, I want to get to you now because you have the wonderful mix of putting together the studies, but while also still touching America's youth at Duquesne University on a regular basis when it comes to economics. So you get to tell the truth versus some others that are living out of the ivory tower, if you will. But you also have the money question. You're going to have to provide the money line for all these people, which is this. How do you raise revenue in 2015 and beyond without raising tax rates any more than what we are? Because based on what these three gentlemen have said, it's already been a huge burden for many people throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. How do we get more revenue without raising those rates?
Well, I know everyone hates paying taxes, right? Especially more in taxes. And then when politicians talk about raising more revenue, they usually say, well, you can't avoid raising the tax rates. And that's not always true. So today I want to tell you about two ways we can increase the tax revenue. If you need to, if you want to, we can increase the tax revenue without having to raise the tax rates. And one way to do so is to broaden the tax base, which allows us to tax virtually everything, but at a very, very low rate, where we actually might be able to decrease the tax rates and still raise plenty of revenue. For example, look at Hawaii. They have 4.5 to 4% sales tax on virtually everything. Virtually everything you buy in Hawaii is taxed. And that's a good example of a very wide tax base that allows them to keep the rate very, very low, which is not only fair because almost everyone pays that tax. So almost everyone is a stakeholder in the government, and almost nobody avoids it. So it's not just fair, but it's also efficient because the tax rate is very, very low, and that doesn't harm economic activity. It doesn't harm trade as much as a high tax rate would. So it's a very important lesson I teach in my principles of economics, is that if there are two ways to raise revenue, there is a wrong way, and that is create a very narrow base and a very high tax rate, and that's what usually happens. And we have plenty of that in Pennsylvania, as Jake just described. And that's the wrong way of going about it. The better way is to have a very wide tax base that doesn't harm people as much, especially low-income people, and allows a lot of prosperity and efficiency to happen at the same time. So one of my papers that I published with the Mercatus Center, in that paper I show that states that have lower tax rates grow much faster than the states that have higher tax rates, holding everything else the same. And that is a very important lesson to keep in mind, keeping the base wide and tax rate low. So to help you remember that point, I'd like to recite a verse from a pop song. It's all about the base, about the base. Who knew that songwriters are so good at economics, right? So, but seriously, so that's one way of raising enough revenue, yet hopefully keeping tax rates low, or maybe even cutting them potentially. The other way of raising more revenue without increasing the rates is to have the right mix of taxes. For example, I'll give you an example of what is not a good tax, and that is a corporate income tax in the United States. It's the third highest in the world at 39%, and it's the second highest in the developed world. Japan is a little higher in terms of corporate income tax. And look at Japan. How fast are they growing? Not very fast. They have what they call a lost decade because they haven't grown for almost a decade. And I don't think it's a coincidence. They have really anti-business attitudes, and that essentially results in very slow economic growth and prosperity. And we can learn a lot from that. So when you look at the statutory rate of 39%, and people might say, well, it's a statutory rate, so nobody ever pays that because of the deductions and exemptions. But I think the Tax Foundation calculated that the effective rate is still one of the highest in the nation at 30 plus or something like that. So depending on the corporation, they might pay still effectively over 30% federal income tax, federal corporate tax rate. And then on top of that, add 9.99% in Pennsylvania, and
Not 10.
10.
9.99.
Right. 10%.
Yeah.
Good round number. 10% tax rate on top of the federal one, and you can see why foreign corporations or even domestic corporations will say, why would I want to do business in Pennsylvania where I have to pay second highest tax rate on corporate income in the nation. And then on top of that, of course, the federal one. So it certainly doesn't create much of an incentive for businesses to stay in this state or our country, and they will go somewhere else, as they often do. And in general, let me summarize other arguments why the corporate income tax is not a good tax. So it's not a good tax for the following reasons. Many people think that corporations actually pay taxes, but they don't. It's always people. So often corporate taxes get passed on to consumers in terms of higher prices. They get passed on to workers in terms of lower wages, and sometimes to fall on shareholders. And by the way, not all shareholders are rich people. I know students in my classes who invest a couple $100 in the stock market just to, kind of play in the stock market. And they essentially pay those taxes in terms of lower dividends and lower prices for the shares that they buy. And then you have retirees, who may also not be very rich, who also pay essentially corporate taxes because they suffer in terms of lower dividends and they suffer in terms of lower capital gains when they sell their stocks. And so that tax gets distributed across a wide segment of population, some of whom, some of the people, of course, many of us are not the rich people that the government is trying to tax with the corporate income tax. So for a variety of reasons, it's not fair, it's not very efficient, and it discourages a lot of job creation and investment in this country. And when you combine all these taxes, you see that Pennsylvania is looking not very attractive for business creation and job creation because we seem to overtax people that we don't want to tax with the corporate income tax. And we also discourage businesses from coming here and creating jobs and investing in our infrastructure, investing in productive assets and machines and whatever it might be. And so when we're looking at taxes that we don't want to have, corporate income tax is one of them, and we can certainly lower that rate. And in fact, I would go even further. I would suggest that we should probably treat all income the same. To be fair, I think what Jake highlighted is a good point in the Pennsylvania Constitution, and that is equal treatment of people. And so when you look at different types of income, it is very difficult to justify treating different types of income differently when it comes to the tax code. Who cares how you earn your money? If it's your own business, or if you earn your income through wages, or if you get dividends, why should you pay different taxes if it's the same level of income? But we effectively do that. We tax corporate income differently from personal income, from proprietorial income, and it's really not all that fair or efficient to do that. We essentially create different rules for different industries and different forms of income, and that strikes me as a very bad tax policy on any kind of grounds, either fairness or efficiency or complexity. It becomes a very complex tax code, and we can certainly simplify it, make it more efficient and fair. There's a lot of room for improvement. And
thank you, Professor. Appreciate it. Thank you. Now, if you have questions, continue to bring them up. I appreciate it. I want to throw at least one question out that I have while I was listening to you four gentlemen. And again, thank you for your expertise and sharing it with all of us here today. One of the things that came up in each one of you all's speech and presentation is bringing down taxes to help the whole community overall. And one of the most evil, wretched myths that we hear about tax and tax reform is the fact that you're only going to bring tax rates down to help the rich. You can care less about the poor, and the only way that you can help the poor is by raising taxes, even though they don't really pay taxes if you're only making but so much money. But each one of you brought up a point as to why a lower tax rate can help the poor and help prosperity overall. Can each one of you just take a couple of minutes and go after how bringing down local tax rates, state tax rates, even the federal tax rates can help the poor get them back to prosperity and back to embracing the American dream? Nate.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's two sides. One is, I think Pablo referred to this, that taxes are passed on to people, whether it's even, the corporate tax is going to be passed on through lower wages, fewer jobs, higher prices. So we have high taxes. They're passed on even to the poor. So even if they may not be paying the tax directly, they're affected by it. But the second part is kind of just the philosophy of government, that the poor are not helped most through the welfare programs. They're helped most through jobs and job creation and a robust economy. And lowering our overall tax burden and specific taxes that discourage investment in the state is the best way to help the poor, because the free market system has done more to reduce poverty than any government program in history.
Joseph, I'm going to bounce that off you very quickly. You study all 50 states. You see that part of this, when it comes to tax policy at the state level, is also driving the population migration patterns as well. And there's a reason why people are going towards the Sun Belt. It's not just the great weather. We have great weather here today in Pennsylvania, but it's also because of those tax policies for jobs and for business growth, right?
Well, I work at the Tax Foundation, so you'd expect my answers to be all about taxes, and normally it is, although I am always the first to admit that lots of things influence individual and business location decisions. Education matters, transportation matters, weather matters, food matters. There's a lot of people who live in New York because you can get a hot sandwich at 3 in the morning, and that matters to some people. And I've even read one study that found a significant relationship between where the wife of the CEO wants to live and where the headquarters of the business is. But taxes are very important too, and if you want the academic evidence on that, we at our website at taxfoundation.org, one of my colleagues, one of our economists, went through every piece of academic literature that looked at the link between economic growth and taxes. And we laid it out there, all the studies for, all the studies against. There's more studies for than against. But that's all out there, and you can send it to people who argue with you on that. But you see it in the evidence, too. If you list all of the states with bad tax policy, a lot of the same states have the outward migration. And if you list all the states with good tax policies, you see a lot of the same states with in-migration. And if weather was all that matters, then my home state of California would have net inward migration, not net outward migration, which includes me, incidentally.
Jake, anything that you'd like to add to that? I know you brought this up as well.
Well, it's pretty straightforward, but the notion that corporations pass on taxes or businesses pass on taxes is true to the extent that they can pass the higher prices on, or that they can reduce the wages of their employees. A lot of employees may lose their jobs, but the issue is higher taxes basically reduce the rate of return on investment. If you reduce the rate of return on investment, people are going to look for other places to put their investment. Capital goes where it feels welcome, and it stays where it's wanted. And if we want to grow a state, then you've got to make investment prospects good. Part of the issue is, as Joe mentioned, it's not just taxes. There are other issues that affect costs, transportation, union climate. A lot of that probably has as much effect on some companies as the taxes themselves. So we shouldn't just put everything on taxes.
Bob?
Joe mentioned some academic research on this topic, and I'd like to add more to it. In my Mercatus paper on state prosperity and economic growth and taxation, I actually found that out of the top 10 population gaining states, 5 don't have an income tax. Is that a coincidence? I don't think it is. Consider how many states don't have an income tax. It's 9 at most, depending how you count it, or 7, and 5 out of them are in the top 10 population gaining states. They also gain a lot of business. So it's not just people coming in, it's also businesses that are coming in. So they have more firms, they produce more, they compete more, give people lower prices, give people more jobs, and people love that, and that's why they move to those states. So I don't think it's a coincidence. Of course, other factors matter too, but if you look at the evidence, it's there. It's hard to ignore. People like lower taxes, and it benefits everybody, from rich to the poor.
Let's get to some of these questions. You can always continue to bring them up here as we continue through for the next 15 minutes or so. First question I have here. Are tax-free zones considered corporate welfare? Since we're speaking of the poor, this is a very popular campaign tagline or something to bring up in a speech that I'm going to bring about these tax-free zones, these empowerment zones. Are these actually just different forms of corporate welfare? Why or why not?
I would say in some ways that they are. They are reducing taxes on very specific targeted corporations. In some ways, they're very driven by politics. In fact, some of these tax-free zones are created for specific companies or for specific, cronies, if you will. But the bottom line is, if a tax-free zone is good for a very small region, it should be good for the whole state. And the fact of the matter is, by creating certain tax-free zones that have special privileges, and not reducing spending. I mean, usually those are done while keeping spending at the same level or higher. You're basically requiring everyone else to pay a higher tax rate, and that's, as we know, most businesses aren't benefiting from tax-free zones or tax incentives, and so a fair system would be to to lower the overall tax rate on all businesses and all families.
Let me get one more, Jake, please.
The Keystone Opportunity Zones was a tax-free, basically a tax-exempt zone for companies that moved in. The idea was there if you take an old industrial site that nobody would spend the money to clean up unless you created an incentive. So there's an incentive built into that to get somebody to undertake expenditures they wouldn't ordinarily do. Now the question is, do you create an unfair competitive situation because those people are not paying corporate income taxes, they're not paying sales taxes, they're not paying property taxes compared to their another company down the street. So it's a very tricky thing to do. They've been tried, and I don't know that they've been all that successful in generating a lot of business, although they have done some good, but by and large, I think they get misused, as most of these kinds of programs do, and I would stay away from them as best as possible, and just keep overall tax rates low, including property taxes, which are a major element for businesses in this state because you have so many places where school property taxes are prohibitive for companies as well as homeowners.
Thank you, Jake. Let me get to this next question, and Professor, I think this one's for you because you brought this up and you started this out, and this is what this person wants to know. Can you give a compelling argument why lowering the tax rate can actually increase tax revenue? I know that you try to touch upon this, but do you have an example where you can say, for example, the city of XYZ in the state of so-and-so, they brought this down and this is what they saw in their coffers going up over this amount of time?
Well, it's a tricky question because there's this concept in economics known as the Laffer curve. So depending on where you are, lower tax rates might actually decrease or increase the revenue. So it all depends on where you are and how the tax rates are at the moment. And if nothing else happens in the economy, then you can predict what's going to happen to the tax revenue. In real life, everything is changing at the same time. So that's the challenge for economists or social scientists to find out the answer to that question, because so many things change at the same time as tax rates change, and it's hard to say what's really causing the change in revenue. But I'll give you some evidence from countries that adapted a flat income tax. I don't know that happened in Russia, and I know that happened in some Eastern European countries. They went from a highly progressive income tax to a flat tax, and I know Russia, when they enacted that reform, they had an enormous surge of revenue. First of all, because people didn't find it beneficial to avoid paying taxes anymore, because to them, 13% flat tax rate was much better than trying to dodge the taxes and potentially go to jail when they used to pay 40 or more % in taxes. So all of a sudden, when they did the cost-benefit analysis, said, you know what, 13% is not too bad, I can do that. I have more incentives not to cheat, not to avoid the IRS or whatever it might be, the tax collectors, because 13% is much better than what they used to pay, which might be 45 or more. So the evidence that I've seen from studies that look at when countries switch to a flat income tax, they usually see a surge in revenue.
Thank you. Now, I know, how many of you drive a car in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania? After this particular winter, this question's for you. Pennsylvania's roads are in deplorable shape, especially after this hard winter. Last year, a major gas tax increase was enacted specifically to address our deteriorating roads and bridges. Where is that money? And will all of it go towards transportation? And I guess we can answer that specifically, and I'll go to you two middle gentlemen on this, Jake, you first, but then it broadens to, you pay a tax, you think it's going to this location, but in actuality, 60% goes here, 30% goes there, et cetera. So specifically in broader terms, what about that gas tax?
I think most of the increase in, it actually comes out of the oil company franchise tax, most of it. I mean, that's where the increase in revenue is coming from, but that's being passed on down to the consumer. But the revenue that's coming in is mostly going into the transportation fund. I don't think there's much chance that you could divert a lot of that money. I mean, you know, there may be some, but, and you have to remember too that the Turnpike borrows $450 million a year to support, now all of it's going to mass transit. So if you're driving the Turnpike, you're going to be paying extra tolls, ever increasing tolls, in order to support people on mass transit. That's probably a bad way to do that, but I don't think there's much question that the increase of revenue from the oil company franchise tax is not going into roads and bridges. It's just there's a lot of roads and bridges to work on, and they get behind. They were behind the 8 ball to start with, and it's going to take a long time to get caught up. And we'll call attention to something that Nate said, and that's the prevailing wage. Prevailing wage in this state probably costs 30% more to do these projects than it would be if we didn't have it. So if you want to work on something that could save a lot of money, that would be the place to go.
Nate, I want to ask you this real quick question. If you take 30 seconds to this, and you talked about the status quo of tax policy, which gets into the sentiment of the taxpayer. How does the taxpayer of today relate to the taxpayer, let's say, of 10 years ago in regards to saying, I'm actually getting something out of the taxes that I'm paying? Do people feel like they're getting less out of the taxes that they're paying today than they may have 10 or 20 years ago?
Well, I mean, I think taxes have always been unpopular, and if you do polling of people, I mean, how do people think? Are they overtaxed or undertaxed? I think there's maybe 1% of the population who say, yeah, I'm undertaxed, raise my taxes. Certainly, you know, you look at that we're paying more than ever before. Spending is at an all-time high, and you know, dissatisfaction is at an all-time high in terms of dissatisfaction with state government or federal government. I think people are not seeing that they're getting what they're paying for.
Goes to this, and I actually have a question that goes to that if we have time, but I want to go to this one because this takes it back to the federal level. What role can states have in getting Congress to eliminate the IRS and or get a flat or fair tax or a consumption tax? How much role can states have in changing the federal tax structure?
Well, I think a lot of it is setting a good example, and we see states, a lot of states starting to do that now. Making sure that you're spending within your means and making sure that you're coming up with a tax system that grows the economy and creates jobs. And too much, I mean, in 2012, the debate over federal tax policy was exclusively about redistribution. I think it matters just as much that we need to be debating about economic growth. And states like the ones I mentioned are doing it. Even one I didn't mention, the District of Columbia, the mayor there proposed a sales tax increase, and the city council said, we just talked to the bond agencies and we promised them we're not raising taxes. And there's as many Republicans on that city's council as there are Democrats in this room. And so if the DC City Council is getting it, I would hope a lot of states are getting it. And I think a lot of the innovation and the leadership we're going to see in the next few years is going to come from governors and from state legislators, and hopefully Congress will pay attention to that.
Which would be part of the reason why perhaps we're seeing a lot of governors running for president, particularly on our side of the aisle coming into 2016 for that very reason. And that's something that Rick Perry talked about in 2012. I'm sure we're going to hear it from Scott Walker as well. And if somebody like a Bobby Jindal jumps in, he's going to try to make similar type of arguments. This one comes straight out of the headlines. Would an increase in income tax and sales tax be advisable if property taxes are eliminated in Pennsylvania?
Well, there's two things with that. One is, you know, the question of which is, the property tax is a bad tax, and that's what a lot of the push for this is. Let's get rid of the property tax because it's terrible, it burdens homeowners. But you have to recognize the income tax is a bad tax, and the sales tax is a bad tax. The real question is, what is the least bad tax? And there is some good argument why the property tax is the most harmful. The other part of the premise behind this property, shifting away from the property tax and getting rid of that, is this idea that, well, property taxes are high because the state is not spending enough on education. That's false. We spend record high level from the state. Pennsylvania spends near the national average on spending per student from state government. The reason property taxes are high is because property taxes are high. And school spending is high. We spend more than the rest of the country. And so when we've talked about this potential shift, we want to pair it with some of the spending reforms, prevailing wage, which impacts schools, pension reform, which is really one of the biggest drivers of why property taxes are going through the roof, and certainly labor reforms because the contracts that unions are negotiating with schools are driving up the costs and driving up local property taxes.
It's important to note how this the idea of that compares with what Governor Wolf has proposed. So your neighbor to the east, New Jersey, has very high property taxes and has had very high property taxes, highest in the country for decades. They used to not have an income tax, and in the 60s they brought in an income tax, and they said they would use the money to lower property taxes. And then I think it was in the 80s, they raised the sales tax, and they said we're going to use that money to lower property taxes. And then in the early 2000s, they said, well, we're going to put in a new income tax on millionaires, and we're going to use that to lower property taxes. Well, New Jersey now not only still has the highest property taxes in the country, they also have one of the highest income taxes and one of the highest sales taxes. Because this whole trade-off is not about lowering property taxes. It's we're going to increase state aid to local governments and hope that they reduce property taxes. And somehow that never translates into action because property taxes are a local issue. And if you think they're too high, the local government is who you have to be talking to, not the state government. All the state government can do is move around the money on the table. And often when they do that, it doesn't actually result in lower property taxes as we've seen in New Jersey.
Jake.
I think if you're talking about eliminating property taxes for schools, are you still leaving property taxes in place for counties and municipalities? In that case, you'd still need to do assessments. If you're talking about eliminating for schools, are you talking about eliminating them for residential, or are you talking about eliminating them entirely? This issue gets very, very complicated when you start talking about eliminating all property taxes, because then you'd have to raise $13 to $14 billion to replace just the school taxes. And this business about the state not providing enough money is a red herring, because one of the reasons that the state provides only 40% of the funding, as the proponents of higher spending say, is because the property taxes are so high in many districts in this state. It's not because the poor districts are not getting enough state funds. It's because the rich districts are getting so little state funds, and they're paying for it out of their property taxes. So if you eliminate the property taxes, you're going to have a real problem deciding how to reallocate the money. You've got school districts that are spending over $20,000 raising most of the money out of their local property tax. If you say you can only spend $15,000 because you can't levy a property tax and this is all you're going to get from the state, those people are going to be up in arms. So this is a very complicated thing, and we have to think about how we're going to resolve this. I'd like to see property taxes eliminated just because I would like to see it. I think it would operate better, but you've got a lot of obstacles to jump over here before that's ever going to happen.
Bob, I'm going to give you the last question before we get out of here, and that is, for states that have put in significant tax reform policies, structures, et cetera, how long does it take before they end up seeing substantive change that betters their state, their communities, et cetera?
Well, if you measure that in terms of economic growth, where incomes rise on average, I think the results are pretty fast. When I looked at annual changes in tax rates over time across 50 states in my study, I found that the relationship is almost instantaneous when it comes to the average tax rate. If we tax people on average less, they spend more, they create more jobs, they try to move into that state that has a lower tax burden on average. So the response is pretty fast. Again, many other factors matter too, but I find that on average the response is almost on an annual basis.
That is definitely a note to keep hope for. Give these gentlemen a round of applause, and thank you very much for participating. Thank you. You all enjoy the rest of your day. God bless.